Okay, well, it's good to see so many of you return to the ongoing webinar series that we have with political and other business leaders from Ireland and the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. Today, we have a very special program in conjunction with Northern Ireland Bureau and a continuation of the Northern Ireland at Boston College leadership series. I'm really excited to speak with today's guest, Minister Conor Murphy. He's a member of local assembly to Northern Ireland and the Minister of Finance. But before we turn to our conversation with the Minister, Mr. Andrew Elliott, the Director of Northern Ireland Bureau, will say a few words. Many of you are now familiar with Andrew, but he came out to Washington last year to head up the Northern Ireland Bureau. Previously, Andrew served in Brussels, as well as working with the Northern Ireland Executive on parades and other matters. Andrew, if you have a few moments, maybe you could say a few words to our attendees.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that introduction, and also for the opportunity to partner with the Global Leadership Institute on this series of interviews that kicked off with our Justice Minister in October. I suppose by way of introduction is probably maybe an idea to quote from the new President-elect, Joe Biden, when he talked recently about reaching across the aisle, treating opposition politicians not as enemies, but as opponents with whom we need to work in order to make the best things happen. And I suppose one of the messages that we can have from the region that I'm pleased to represent here in the United States is that as a result of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, that's what happens today in the region that Conor Murphy and the other ministers in the executive represent. So the executive comprises ministers from right across the political spectrum, collaborating together to make what are sometimes very difficult decisions in a challenging year. Hailing from the rugged beauty of South Armagh, Conor is one of our most experienced ministers. He was Minister for Regional Development between 2007 and 2011, and is now Minister for Finance, which also gives him responsibility for human resources policy in the executive as well. In terms of his responsibilities, if you look at it in terms of the balance of the Good Friday Agreement, he is responsible for a great deal of East-West activity, particularly engaging with Treasury in London and so on, and many of the issues concerning the executive's budget. He has North-South responsibilities in terms of oversight of the North-South bodies that were established under the Good Friday Agreement. And of course, he has a great deal of internal responsibility in managing the competing demands, and they are quite heavy demands at present from different ministers across the executive. In terms of human resources, I suppose there's never been a year in recent times when leadership and resilience have been more greatly needed within the civil service in order just to continue the really good work that's been going on in developing a modern, successful economy and a fairer society in the region that I'm proud to represent here in Washington, DC. So without any further ado, I'll now hand back to you to introduce the Minister, Bob.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. I really appreciate it. And again, we appreciate your partnership and your good-natured willingness to engage with us here at Boston College on this important series, and one that I've found fascinating and a lot of fun as well to work on. I will say for our attendees, we will have further programs as part of the Northern Ireland Boston College Leadership Series. January 27th, we'll be welcoming Diane Dodds, Minister for the Economy, into this forum. And then there'll be further programming in the new year. But this is the final webinar for the Global Leadership Institute this calendar year. And we're really pleased to welcome Minister Conor Murphy to this discussion. If you have a question, please use the question and answer function, and I'll relay that to the minister. You can also use the chat function, but we will try to get to all the questions that you might have during this conversation. Minister Murphy has already been introduced a little bit by Andrew. He began his political life in the Assembly Committee, and then in 1998, he served for representing Newry and Mourne to the Assembly in Stormont. In 2005, Conor, you were elected as an MP, and that was a particularly, I think, interesting election. It was the first one that Sinn Féin won in Newry Armagh, and you unseated Seamus Mallon at that point. You left the Assembly for a period because of Sinn Féin's policy on double jobbing, and you remained in Westminster. But then you returned to the Assembly in 2015, and in January, when the Assembly took up its role again, you took the position of Minister for Finance. So it's been quite an interesting journey in your political life. But before we get into your role as a minister and some of the policies that you're pursuing and the function in the executive, I thought maybe you could talk about yourself for our audience a little bit. I mean, why did you initially enter electoral politics? You were active before that. You remember the IRA, of course, and you were naturally interested in the political future of Northern Ireland. But what drew you to take up this position with Sinn Féin?
Well, thanks very much, Bob, for the introduction, and to Andrew as well. I mean, I suppose I was a child of the Troubles. I grew up in the 60s when the civil rights protests were really starting to kick off, and the demands for basic equality and basic human rights in the North after 50 years of unionist rule were really starting to gather pace, mirroring, I suppose, the civil rights protests in America and other protests right across the world, where people started to become more active and more vocal in terms of demands for equality. And I was a child watching all of that. I had a family history and background in relation to the independence struggle in Ireland. My grandfather had been involved in the war for independence back in the 1920s, and my uncle was interned in the 1970s by the British when the Troubles kicked off. So we had a family history which was very much involved in Irish politics and politics for independence and for unity in Ireland. And my grandfather, ironically, had fought in the War of Independence, and when the border was artificially then put in Ireland just 100 years next year, our family found ourselves about 4 or 5 miles on the wrong side of the border. And so, having fought for independence and freedom in Ireland, he was denied that very freedom by the outworking of the truce and the treaty that followed the War of Independence, and then lived as my parents did and my own siblings under the reality of life in the Northern Ireland side of the border and the single party rule in terms of unions there. So it was, I suppose, a family that was steeped in politics and political struggle. I grew up in a time when the denial of basic civil rights then kick-started a very long and bitter conflict. And I suppose it was very hard not to be drawn into that. The area that I lived became one of the most militarized zones in Europe at that stage, I think. And a very, very, I suppose, hard struggle between the people of that area and the British Army, who established a very strong presence in the area, and was always renowned as an area of resistance, right back through centuries of resistance to the British state's involvement in Ireland. And so it was no surprise that became a feature of our lives as children growing up and then as young adults. And then ultimately, as Sinn Féin began to develop as a political party and started to pursue a peace strategy, trying to involve electoral politics as a way of creating peaceful and democratic change in Ireland, then I became drawn to that, and that's how I ended up becoming an elected representative for Sinn Féin, and ultimately becoming involved in the Good Friday Agreement, and have been elected to the Assembly and as an MP in Westminster ever since that point.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the skill sets, right? This is interesting to me. I'm a political scientist by training, and that movement, from your time with the IRA to your work with Sinn Féin. Now you're one of the top political leaders for Sinn Féin, and we'll get into some of this. But you've been quite instrumental in some of the recent agreements, and you've led a negotiating team. What did you learn that you took with you as you made that journey? What kind of served you well as a political leader, in the forums that you're now taking part in?
Well, I was very fortunate in that I was part of a collective leadership with particularly people like Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, who were very strong political leaders who are very clever in terms of their foresight as to what circumstances were required to bring about change. And bear in mind, we had come through 30 years of a very bloody conflict, which most people thought was intractable. Most people had very little hope of the ability to ever change that into a peaceful process. And we still struggle at times with peace in Ireland. It's not a completed journey from the conflict right through to resolution and peaceful political change. But nonetheless, we're in a much better place today than we were in 1990s, in the mid-90s, when the ceasefires and the conflict came to an end. And so I was very fortunate that I worked closely with people who had been through all of that, who had been leaders for many years, who were very clear in their thinking, very single-minded in their determination to continue to try and achieve self-determination in Ireland for the whole people on the island, but to do so to actually transform the political circumstances in which that could be achieved. And that was a huge undertaking. But bear in mind, Ireland is characterised by conflict every century since the British state became involved in Ireland. And no one has ever resolved that issue in a peaceful fashion. Ultimately, even the War of Independence in the 1920s only partially resolved the issue of Irish self-determination and of the future of the Irish nation. So it was a huge undertaking, and it was absolutely a privilege to be involved in that. I was very fortunate that I was a part of that leadership. And we also learned from peaceful attempts to resolve conflicts in a peaceful way in other parts of the world. And we at that time had a very close working relationship with the ANC. And the South African peace process, if you like, was just a number of years ahead of our own. And we learned quite a bit from the people who had been involved on Mandela's team in those negotiations, and how to maintain a negotiation, but maintain your support, maintain the confidence of the people that you were representing. Because if you were in a negotiation and you'd lost all of your support base, you weren't any value to the people on the other side of the table. You only were a value of the amount of people you could bring along with you in any particular outcome to that negotiation, but also to maintain the core of your political beliefs. So we believe in self-determination for the Irish people. We believe in peaceful political change. We believe in ending the British state's involvement in Ireland. We think it's been bad for our country. We think partition has been disastrous for our country for 100 years. And we think that has all stunted the growth and the potential of the Irish nation as a single island and an ability to manage its own affairs. And so it was a real challenge to manage that. Because a lot of people we represented came through a very bitter conflict. They were very, very suspicious and hostile to the British state, to the British government's involvement in Ireland, to unionism, to all the circumstances that had dictated their lives as they had grown up, and to try and get people to engage with what had been the enemy, to try and work out a peaceful solution to all of that was indeed, given the history of Ireland going back over many centuries, was a challenge. But the ANC had always told us that the most important negotiation you will have is with your own people, because you can negotiate with your opponents on the other side of the table, but if you don't negotiate with your own people and bring them along, and they have a clear understanding of what your objectives are, what the limitations are in a negotiation, because there are always limitations, and how you can achieve what you wish to achieve, and then move on further into that process, and you have a long-sighted view of where you want to get to in that, and you hold to that, and people have confidence that you'll do that, then those are all characteristics which we try to apply to our negotiations over many, many years. And in effect, we began negotiating in the mid-90s, and effectively we're still negotiating, but it's a much better approach to doing business than war, I can assure you. And even though it has many, many challenges, it ultimately, I think, has created a much better place on this island for all the people who live here, whatever their allegiances, and given us a clear roadmap as to how we can resolve issues in the future. And it is also because part of our work over the years has been to then in turn assist other regions in the world where conflict seems intractable. And I've been involved in very many conflict resolution processes. And even though at times we're frustrated with our own and the pace of change and just the problems that we encounter on a daily basis, internationally, when we go to other places, they look to Ireland as an inspiration of somewhere where it looked like conflict could never be resolved. And yet it was put away, and peaceful solutions have been found. And the journey to a peaceful change in Ireland is well underway at this stage.
Minister, it's very interesting that you talk about your relationship with your own supporters and the importance of maintaining that as you negotiate, with your political opponents in other parties or, in the British government or what have you. How do you manage your role as a leader in Sinn Féin alongside of your role as Minister for Finance, where you have a different kind of responsibility, right? So your responsibility isn't only to your electorate or those members of Sinn Féin, it's the entire, population of the region in Northern Ireland, or you have a responsibility to other governments in your role. So how does that work at the level of the executive for you?
Well, I mean, I often say to the people here in the department where I'm sitting, this is 1/3 of my work. I have a responsibility as an elected representative for the people who elect me in the Newry and Armagh constituency and the South Armagh part of it that I represent. I'm a national leader of a political party, which is a 32 county party, which is right across the whole island of Ireland, is represented in the Dáil in the Parliament in Dublin, is represented in Belfast. Have people who are elected to Westminster, have people who are elected to the European Parliament. So that's a huge management role. I'm a party officer. I'm one of the party leaders of that of Sinn Féin, and so those are challenges. It is at times a juggling exercise. And then someone reminded me today, but what about your family? And I said, well, they have always known that they find a place somewhere in the middle of all of that. But it is a challenge, of course, because not only am I trying to manage this department within a constitutional framework that I'm trying to change, which I didn't, and people I represent don't hold much allegiance to, but recognise that this is the way to work through these problems to get to a different constitutional arrangement in this island. But I also have a responsibility in this post to try and better the lives of all of the citizens who live in the northern state, regardless of their political allegiance, to try and make things better for people, to try and provide decent public services, to try and argue for as much money as we can possibly get to invest in the economic support that our people live in and require here, because this is consistently one of the worst performing economies in these islands and has been for many years. And that's a consequence of partition and all of the economic difficulties that has brought both parts of the island, but particularly the northern part. Because bear in mind, when partition was created, this was the powerhouse of Ireland. This was the industrial base of Ireland, and it has shrunk way beyond that position ever since. So that's a responsibility, a day-to-day responsibility. I have responsibility for trying to be part of one of the largest, if not the largest party across the island, who's intent on trying to get into government in North and South to bring about political change. And I've also responsibility to the constituents who elect me, the people who have always supported me over 30 years of elections that I've stood in my area, and to try and make sure that I better their circumstances, that I represent them effectively and the interests that they have and the type of Ireland that they want to see developed and brought about. So it is a juggling task at times, but nonetheless, it's all I've known for the last 30 years. So I suppose I'm well used to it at this stage, and I still have my eye fixed on that ultimate prize of big change in Ireland and a country which sets its own future and determines its own future and is responsible for its own actions and is united and reconciled with itself in that.
Ministers, it's interesting you bring up in the industrial past of Northern Ireland. It took me so long to complete my research on my dissertation, and most of which I did at the Linenhall Library in Belfast, because I spent most of my time, to be absolutely honest with you, looking at the videos of Belfast at the turn of the century. And it was remarkable to me, things like the shift change at the Harlan and Wolff shipyard. The streets were thronged with people. I mean, 10 abreast. It was a big workforce. Can you talk about some of the key things that you're doing right now to address the decline in the industrial economy of Northern Ireland?
Well, the office that I'm sitting in now is actually within sight of the Harlan Wolff cranes. It's on the edge of the harbour estate, and Belfast is a city which has lost its industrial heart over many years, and a lot of cities that were part of the British Empire, it did lose that over the years because that empire changed in its nature and didn't become the world economic powerhouse that it had been, and obviously cities which were attached, and the experience is the same in the States, were attached to heavy industry, have lost out, and they have to adapt. Like everywhere else, we have to adapt to changing economic circumstances. We suffer from a lack of fiscal control here. So even though we have a devolved administration in Belfast run from Stormont, about 90% of our revenue that we have to use to try and support the people here and the economy here comes directly from London. That's not that that we don't raise and pay taxes. We pay our taxes directly to London, and we get about 90% of our budget back. So we have very limited fiscal levers to try and make economic interventions specific to our own economy. So we tend to lag behind whatever the decisions are taken by the British government in relation to their own economic interests, which most people will accept centre really around London and the Greater London region. And so we have long argued for more fiscal powers, and that's why we argue for autonomy for Ireland in general. But we have argued in the interim period to have more fiscal powers available to Stormont so that we can actually develop support mechanisms for our own economic growth, even in these very challenging circumstances. And this year has been hugely challenging. We've not only had the pandemic to deal with, but we have Brexit, the exit of the British state from Europe against the wishes of the people of the north of Ireland here. But we're being dragged along with that. And so that presents very real challenges to us. And we want to have more fiscal levers at our disposal to try and affect our own change in the areas that we feel are priorities for us. Even if we have different views in relation to the constitutional future of this place, I think collectively we do want to see it prosper. We do want to see the economy grow. We want to see that circumstance whereby we are the poorest performing economy in these islands change, and to be able to, I suppose, make our own way in terms of economic growth and support for people, to end that kind of exodus of young people who have gone through university out of the country, and to try and sustain that. So those are all challenges, but as I say, the ability to control our own finances, to control our own economy is a constant battle with London, because Treasury dictates policies in a certain regard, certain fiscal policies anyway, and that then dictates how much resource you have to dedicate to economic policies, which can actually encourage some growth in this part of Ireland.
One of the big things that your office was able to accomplish and that you contributed to were the city and growth deals. And we've been hearing a lot about these here in Boston. Earlier this year, the Golden Bridges Conference took place here in Boston, and your predecessor, Martino Mueller, focused on some of the things that were coming out of that, including the medical school that's going to be opening in Magee. But there's several other things that will be developed out of the city deal, the Belfast Rapid Transit System. There's going to be a Mourne Mountain experience, which would be great. I can tell you, I've been up to the Mourne Mountains hiking, and it is beautiful. But to have an experience to help you understand it a little bit might be interesting as well, especially since I was nearly blown off one of the mountains in a very windy day there. But maybe you could talk a little bit about that city deal and what its impact, what do you expect its impact to be on areas across Northern Ireland?
Well, the city deals package that we've got, we have one for Belfast, we have one for the Northwest, which will involve Derry, and then we have some growth deals for the other more rural areas of the north. And those are about trying to pump prime the economy. So there's a certain amount of money that the British government is bringing to the table. The executive, the administration here in Belfast are allocating a matching amount of money from the resources we have, and it's over a number of years, and it's essentially to we have a big infrastructure deficit here. So around Belfast is well served. We have decent roads, we have rail links, we have 2 airports. But once you go further west, for historical reasons, there've been and into the border areas, there's been a traditional lack of investment in infrastructure, in job creation, and all of those issues. And that's recognised even by those in the executive, I suppose, who still aspire to the union with Britain, have recognised that we need regional balance in our economic growth here. So city deals and that kind of pump priming fund has been to try and assist those areas. Even though I suppose by comparison Belfast is doing quite well, but when you take the comparison of the north as a whole, then with other regions, we're not doing so well. So, and then when you move out to Derry and you move out to the rural areas, particularly in the border, then you find areas which have long time lagged behind the economic performance of all other areas across these islands, across Ireland and across Britain as well. So it is about trying to invest in infrastructure, both hard infrastructure in terms of roads and improve that, but also in terms of broadband, in terms of technology, to invest in that, to try and encourage investment, inward investment, which we have been fairly successful in, not perhaps so much as the South, but Ireland obviously traditionally has a very, very strong relationship, particularly with the United States, a very good relationship with Europe, and we have managed to attract very significant companies onto this island and into the north of the island as well. And that's been very important in terms of assisting economic growth. So the city deals will be to try and establish more economic activity in those areas, to take a longer term investment, because as well as not having the fiscal powers here and relying on about 90% of our revenue coming from nothing, we're also tied to the budget cycle in England. So for instance, this year I was preparing for our budget on the basis of a 3-year budget programme. And at the last moment, the Treasury decided they were going to go again for a 1-year budget. So that makes economic planning in the longer term much harder. Any type of planning in the longer term much harder. So the city deals is an attempt, if you like, to stretch beyond into future years, particularly when you're talking about infrastructure that has such a long lead-in time and a much longer term benefit. Then to get the full value of that, we need a longer term programme. And that's what the city deals is about, is to try and get an agreement to invest in those regions that need it the most, to try and pump prime economic activity there, to work with the people in those areas. So it's a kind of a two-way process. It's not an imposed economic plan from Stormont or from the executive or from my department, but it's actually working with the areas to say, what are the priorities? What are the game changers in your area? If we can invest in those in the longer term, how can we try and sustain some type of growth in the economy here? How can we improve the economic situation for the people who live in this area? And that's what it's really about. It's a kind of a pump priming fund, which we hope will generate a much longer term benefit.
And some of that pump priming is going to be changing as the UK leaves the European Union. The EU structural funds obviously will no longer be there. That's going to be replaced with the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. How does that change your work as Minister for Finance, or will your work as Minister of Finance change as this transition takes place?
Well, I mean, Europe has been very, very good to Ireland, North and South, and membership of the European Union has been. And that's why the people of the North, when they had the opportunity to vote in relation to continued membership, voted very strongly to remain within Europe. Now, unfortunately, we are then counted in, and Scotland voted in the same way to remain within Europe. England, with the numbers that are there, outweighed our democratic input. And so we've been taken out of the European Union against our wishes. And quite clearly, Europe understood, I think, the peace process and the border issues in Ireland much better than the British government did, and have worked very hard in terms of the negotiation, which will see the exit of the British state from Europe, to try and protect the hard-won gains of the Good Friday agreements, the reduction of the border, which came about around that same time with the single market and the customs union, which meant that the border infrastructure in Ireland, which had been such a point of political contention for so many years. I mean, I live only a few miles from it. Then gradually evaporated, and people didn't notice, even though there is clearly a political and a legal border in Ireland, people didn't notice the physical infrastructure of the border so much. So those have all been very sensitive issues. And alongside of that, we attracted a significant amount of funding from Europe. Now, Europe invested money in our peace process, and thankfully that is one fund which is to continue, certainly for the foreseeable future, and it's a programme called Peace Plus. It takes in some infrastructure investment along with investment in peace projects and projects to try and transform lives of communities who suffered most as a consequence of the conflict. And that's been a very important fund specifically designed for Ireland. It involves contributions from the Irish government, the British government, and the European Union as well. But other funds which were available to us, for instance, the agriculture support. I mean, Ireland is very much a small farming area. A lot of the farms are hill farms. They aren't that profitable. They have relied on that, if you like, top-up grant from Europe. That fund is guaranteed for next year, but beyond next year, once Britain's in control of that, we have no guarantees at all. And there's a deep worry around that. Other European social funds and a range of other funds associated with third-level education, Erasmus, Horizon, those types of funds, no guarantees in relation to that. And the other thing which troubles us, and is a similar view in Scotland and Wales, where there are also devolved administrations, is that the British government promised that any lost European funding would be replaced in full. But we would also have the power to allocate design programmes for that to meet our particular circumstances and priorities, and to allocate the funding accordingly. That seems to have been reneged on in the latest legislation going through Westminster, where the Whitehall, the British Government Centre in London, seemed to be intent on holding that funding themselves and allocating it according to their priorities. The priorities of the southern part of England, or England in general, aren't the priorities, aren't the circumstances of the north of Ireland, or even of Scotland and Wales. And collectively with my counterparts, the Finance Minister of Scotland and Wales, we have argued very strongly with British Treasury that this is not what was intended, this was not what was agreed or considered to be agreed, and we see this as an enormous act of bad faith, that we should have the replacement of the funding in full, and we should have the ability to allocate it according to our own priorities. And bear in mind, the British government's central argument to its own people to get them to vote for Brexit was that they would be much better off outside of Europe. We're fighting in terms of replacement of European funding. We'll probably be much worse off, and I suppose that reinforces the point why people here voted to remain.
One of the attendees asks about the, about corporation tax in Northern Ireland, that the decision was taken, and they said they point out the corporation tax in Northern Ireland would no longer be reduced to what it is in the Republic of Ireland. This person wants to know, why was that done? Was it the impact of COVID that has done this? And is the corporation tax something that you'll be returning to in your role?
Well, COVID, as you will know, pandemics don't respect borders that are drawn, the lines drawn on a map. And so Ireland has been considered as one entomological unit for the process of dealing with the virus. I mean, we're a small island. There's only 6.5 million people live on this island, and there I think was a clear logic in having a singular approach across both administrations to this. But unfortunately, with our politics, half of the administration here in the north look to London for their leadership in these matters. And I have to say, the leadership in London, certainly in the early part of this pandemic, left a lot to be desired, and it seemed to have a very strange approach, which really didn't mirror that which was being conducted in any other country across Europe or most of the rest of the world at all. And so it was very clear that there has been All Ireland collaboration in terms of dealing with the pandemic, and certainly I think COVID, and I'm sure the same will happen in countries all over the world, have taught us a lot of lessons about how we should organise society and structure our economy and structure our approach to medicine, our approach to supporting people. And I think there are big lessons to be learned across the island in relation to that. But I think it highlighted the illogicality of partition on a small island where we have two states, two administrations, different sets of policies, and attempt to harmonise as best we could. But we have different school systems, so it was impossible to try and have a common approach to schools. We have different currencies, and we have different taxation systems, we have different health systems. So while there has been some good collaboration and attempts to make sure we harmonise to a certain extent the approach on both sides of the island, it has not always been possible. So if there are restrictions where I live on the other side of the border, there are people who live on one side of the border who shop, who go to school, who socialise on the other side, because that's the closest place to them. And then to have different sets of restrictions, two schools half a mile apart down a road, having two different sets of regulations is just ludicrous in the face of a pandemic. So I think COVID will have taught us a lot of lessons. Unfortunately, it has had a very detrimental effect on people's health and the deaths that we suffered across the island. And I hope that we learn lessons about the sheer illogicality of a small island being partitioned. And I think Brexit and the experience post the 1st of January when Britain eventually leaves, I think will reinforce that illogicality in terms of a border across the island.
Can you talk a little bit about the new decade, new approach agreement? It has several key components to it, but one I think that we've already been talking a lot about are the changes in the institutions and the roles. One issue that I think is interesting to investigate here is the Fiscal Council. There's a commitment to standing up a Fiscal Council. Steve Aiken, the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, has criticized you for not standing one up. Can you talk a little bit about that? Your decision about why? Well, what kinds of, I guess, firstly, what kinds of institutional reforms are important at this juncture, for the executive to pursue? And secondly, is something like the Fiscal Council part of that, or how do you envision that unfolding for you out of your office?
Yeah, well, I mean, part of we only reached an agreement after 3 years of the government being down here over the working practices of the government, which were just untenable for parties to be in government. And we reached agreement after 3 years of negotiation. And part of that was we were looking at fiscal management, even with the limitations in terms of our own fiscal powers. It is good practice, and it is good practice across the world for if you like, an independent oversight and independent contribution from people of expertise in relation to longer term spending. And part of that is to get into a longer term budget process, and that's dictated from that as well. But if we can get back to where they had promised to be, and they did promise as part of the New Decade New Approach agreement to enter into a multi-year budget cycle, then they changed that in terms of their own response to the pandemic in the last month or so. And we're now back to a 1 year cycle again. But it falls to myself in this department to create. I actually was just due to speak before our call started today, and diary clashes prevented that with someone we hope will chair that fiscal council, and we have identified members for it, and we want to talk to them and get that up and running as quickly as possible. We would have had it up earlier in the year, but I suppose governments all over the world trying to deal with the pandemic and the outworkings of all that has absorbed an awful lot of our time, and so deadlines and timeframes for these things have slipped somewhat, but we will get that up and running very quickly. We also want to establish a fiscal commission, which is a different organisation. This has been done in Scotland and done in Wales. Both Scotland and Wales have much more tax raise and tax varying fiscal levers than apply here in Belfast. And so we wanted to establish a fiscal commission to look at what powers the Assembly and the Executive here in Belfast could take back across from Westminster. It could be further powers devolved to us, so we can have actually more control over raising our own revenue, over directing that, not be just so reliant on what policy matters are decided in London. And so the two things, in my view, go side by side. We want more assistance and scrutiny of our longer term finances here, but we also want the ability to generate more income for ourselves, to direct economic attention and support where it's needed most to try and grow our economy here.
Earlier this year, Minister, we spoke with your opposite number in Ireland, Minister Donoghue. And one thing I think that was interesting that came out of that conversation was the role that the Minister for Finance has in terms of creating a budget and delivering it, and then also the way it interacts with all the other government departments. So again, returning to the New Decade's new approach deal, there's a lot in there about the health, housing, public pay, education, criminality, productive investment, where we talked a little bit about city deals. A lot of different policy areas are touched on here. I mean, how important is it for you, as minister, to help deliver the objectives of that agreement across those policy areas? Or is that something that more directly falls to other ministers or other civil servants?
Well, it's a combination of both. I think, this is a five-party coalition. It involves people who are very diametrically opposed, certainly in terms of the Constitution, but also economically. It has people who have very different views in relation to how society should be organised and what programmes should be supported. But it also is challenged to try and bring about peaceful change in Ireland, reconciliation between communities here, to recognise the damage the conflict has done. So we have a much bigger, I suppose, mission in that regard as well. And so we have to manage that, and we want to do that. That's in the best interest of all the people who live here. And my job, I suppose, the executive job is to agree what our programme for government is, and different parties will have different ambitions in all of that, and that's what negotiation is all about, trying to find as much common ground as we can in those regards. And regardless of our views, we do want to see people supported. We want to see a well-funded and resourced health service. We want to see support for vulnerable people. We want to see economic prosperity for all our citizens, a good education system. Those are all things I think we all want to see. How we achieve that, sometimes we differ on. But my job then as Minister for Finance is to try and allocate the limited amount of funding we have, and it is limited. We had hoped for an increase in our budgets this year, but literally on the 25th of the last month, we were just told the sum we have for next year, and that that really, it's no better than we had last year, and that really restricts our ability to achieve all the ambitions that we have. So my job is then to try and slice up that pie, if you like, to try and recognise what the executive's priorities are, to support other ministers. It's not my call. Only the executive will decide if my propositions for where the funding goes are supported. But thus far, I have to say, all of the financial propositions I've brought to the executive over the course of the last year have all been accepted without vote. We've managed to negotiate them out, recognise that we're trying to do our best with very limited resources, and we're trying to support the things which we agreed are important to us. So in one sense, it's difficult because you're managing that five-party coalition, but in another sense, I think there are big issues that we do agree on, and we want to see more resources available to us. We're very common view in relation to that. But we also want to try and see that support going where we have agreed our priorities are in the executive. And my job is to try and do that, to try and underpin that with the finances. I say sometimes it is a juggling exercise, and you will always get some people disappointed when you bring forward a budget proposition. But I think they also recognise that we are trying to do our best. We are trying to spread it across as many of our priorities as we possibly can.
Minister, we've been spending most of our time discussing issues that are being generated from Stormont or Westminster. I just want to take a little bit of broader look for a moment. We are in a political transition here in the United States. The Biden administration will be taking office soon. Do you see a change in the relationship coming between the United States and Northern Ireland? Earlier this year, in fact, only about a month and a half ago, we heard from the special envoy in the webinar series, Mick Mulvaney, about the U.S. approach to transatlantic relationships and to Northern Ireland. But from your perspective, do you anticipate change?
I certainly anticipate more of an interest from the White House in relation to Irish issues. I don't think it's any secret that under the Trump administration, he had other focuses. I respect very much the choice of the Democratic choice of the people of the United States to elect their president, and he has his priorities. And I don't think Ireland was there as much. It's still a very strong interest in Congress. I mean, I was over in Capitol Hill last, not September past, the September before, just when Congress came back. Met quite a lot of senior people, Richie Neal, for one, who's a long-standing friend of Ireland, and had dialogue. And there's still a huge interest in Ireland and a huge desire to see Ireland prosper and do well, and to make that peaceful journey along to a new arrangement in a new country. And you could see that, I think, reflected when the discussion was between Britain and America in relation to a trade deal on the other side of leaving the European Union, where you had a very strong position from the Speaker, from Richie Neal and others, that any arrangement which did not protect the Good Friday Agreement would not receive support from Congress in terms of a trade deal with the United Kingdom and the United States. So I think there is a very strong level of support. Obviously, the President-elect, President Joe Biden, I think has always had that level of interest and a clear engagement. And I know Martin McGuinness, who I worked very closely with, who's sadly passed, had a very strong personal relationship with Joe Biden and kept very regularly in contact with him under the Obama administration. And so he's a person I think has a strong track record. And he's spoken, as you say, very frequently about Ireland and about his desire to see ongoing peaceful change in Ireland, to see Ireland prosper and do well. And so I expect that there will be more of a focus from the White House on that. And they recognise, I think, and President-elect Biden will recognise that we are in very turbulent times here, because, as I say, not just coming out of the pandemic as a common experience across the world, but with Brexit, I think, does challenge some of the fundamentals of our peace agreement in terms of the border issue in Ireland and the constitutional future in Ireland. Because, I mean, we were European citizens, and we retain the right to be European citizens, but to have that removed, that membership of Europe removed from us against our wishes, does fundamentally challenge some of the basis of our peace process. And I think this administration coming into the White House will get that very quickly. We want to be supportive and want to be engaged, and I think that's welcome. I think America, particularly right back to the Clinton administration, has been a very strong friend of the peace process in Ireland, and that's been invaluable. I don't think some of the changes which we have seen and some of the progress we've seen would have been possible without that level of support.
We've heard from, as you already pointed out, many U.S. political leaders that they do not want to see the Good Friday Agreement threatened by the Brexit process. Last week, we had Tom Tugendhat on a webinar with us, and I asked him a question about the Northern Ireland Protocols and whether or not it provided adequate protection of the Good Friday Agreement. And his answer was essentially no, because the adequate protection for the Good Friday Agreement is the European Union. And this is a question that I think has been maybe looked over a little bit in some of the political discussions. What does undermining the Good Friday Agreement actually mean? So, in your mind, when does Brexit threaten, what has already been agreed previously?
Well, I think if you read the Good Friday Agreement, some of it is predicated on our membership of Europe at that time, in 1998, of access to European courts, of courts of human rights, of some of the processes and the legislation which underpins. And bear in mind, we had a conflict here which has its origins in the denial of human rights, the denial of basic fundamental rights that most people, the right to a home, the right to vote. And so the protection of the European Union and its courts was very important to us, and those human rights protections, and that, I suppose, imposition of those rights in terms of the British state and its dealing with Ireland. We have a long, long history of being on the wrong end of human rights approaches of the British state here. So those were fundamentals. The membership of the European Union, the North-South bodies and the arrangements that they put in place, which were part of the Good Friday Agreement, were predicated on our collective membership of Europe, and that peace money that came from Europe, the Interreg money, which is interregional cross-border money, infrastructure money. A lot of those programs were built on that ability to intervene on the island in a very positive way. But even the fundamental democratic principle, where the Good Friday Agreement recognises for the people of the North of Ireland to decide our future, our constitutional future, at the same time as the people of the South in a referendum. We voted in what is essentially a referendum in terms of European membership, which has been part of our political landscape for many, many years. And that vote was ignored and was bypassed, and it was not recognised as having any binding effect by the British government. So those do challenge the very fundamentals of an agreement which was hard fought, which gave us the space to get out of conflict and get into a peaceful resolution. I'm not saying that is threatened in terms of a return to violence, but what I'm saying is a lot of people who had put a lot of faith in the peace process and could chart the progress of it moving along, who knew the fundamental principles that underpinned it, had seriously challenged those. And that the British state could do that without as much as any regard for our views here, or the views of the majority here, not just the views of our community, but the views of the majority of the people who live here, then I think it did present a very significant challenge to that record of peace building over the years. But we will continue, and I think that's why I think the next administration in the White House will have more of a sense of that, will have more of an understanding of that, will recognise that those present difficulties which need to be carefully managed. But I think for the likes of myself and people like me who wish to see change on the island of Ireland, I think it just reinforces our view that, if we want to be in control of our own destiny, if we want to decide which union we want to belong to, is it the European Union or the union with Britain, how do we want to shape our own future, our own economic destiny, our own place in the world, then we can only do that through self-determination. And that means that the people of Ireland have to decide. And I think the European Union also recognised that, because they did put a provision in 2017 that if Ireland was reunited, it automatically re-entered the European Union as a single state. In other places, that hasn't been the case. So I think Europe gets this, and I think the incumbent administration in the United States will get this. And the conversation here in Ireland, outside of the type of traditional Irish republicanism where I come from, the conversation in Ireland increasingly over the last number of years has been about reunification, has been about constitutional change, has been about what's in the best interest of the future of all of the people on this island, and where does our future best lie, because there are some fundamental choices that have been presented to us, particularly as a consequence of Brexit. But generally speaking, I think choices have been presented to us. I think it's time to have the debate to try and settle some of those answers.
We have about 10 minutes left, so I remind the audience, if they have a question, please send it in now. There is actually, Minister, a question on this. Tom Cardy asks, how realistic is this, that there would be a referendum that is taken in Northern Ireland and in Ireland on the future, and that the referendum or referenda would be successful? As you said already, there's a lot of interest in this right now. There are many different groups and working on this particular challenge, but the Brexit issue has really brought it to a point.
No, I think one of the weaknesses of the Good Friday Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement contains within it the provision to have a referendum to decide the future of the island. But one of its weaknesses is that it wasn't specific about how that would be brought about. So it's essentially left to the call of a British Secretary of State. And I think it specifies whenever they feel that a change might be likely to come about, that they would permit or acquiesce to a referendum to be held. And that for us is a weakness in the negotiation of the Good Friday Agreement. And we have long since tried to pin the British government down to actually setting out the terms under which they would consider that. Because I think there's very clearly been a very significant debate, a growing debate across Ireland about what the best future for the country is. And you can see that, it's reaching areas that never before. There have been significant economic studies done, significant, about the economic potential of a reunified country, which are hugely beneficial. There have been significant studies in relation to what All Ireland Health Service might look like. We have argued a long time for the Irish government to set up, if you like, a formal platform for this debate. We have one which can access all of the information they might need if citizens want to discuss how the health service would look like, what taxation would be like, what currency would be using, what education system would be there. That there's actually a forum and a vehicle for debating all of that. And I think that would help enormously. But the one thing I would probably focus the question most is if a British Secretary of State said, these are the conditions on which I would call a referendum. And already the Unionist majority has been lost in the North. And that's what the Northern state was created on historically 100 years ago, was an area of land which could perpetually have a Unionist majority. That has disappeared. Unionism no longer is a majority and hasn't done for the last number of elections. They're consistently, in terms of opinion polls in the South, are supportive of the idea of reunification. And I think with the idea that the majority for the Union has gone, you now have, if you like, a minority for the Union, a minority avowedly in favour of United Ireland, and a large section in between her there to be persuaded. And I think that's essentially where the debate has been. So constitutional change is in the air. Political change has been happening and it's gathering pace. Our argument is that people should try and harness that and have a constructive debate, engage with it, what's in the best interest in terms of all of our futures for all of the people who live here. How do we build in protections? How do we build in human rights protections for people's identity if they want to express themselves as British, their cultural identity, their religious freedoms? All of these matters can be addressed so that when it does come to a referendum and vote, people are voting very clearly on what they know is going to be the situation on the other side of that. And I think that is something that should happen sooner rather than later, but the British government need to call that, and we think they have a duty to call that, given the way that as I said, the fact that the majority for the Union has been lost, and particularly with Brexit, a majority of the citizens here want to remain part of the European Union, then I think they should test where they see their future best.
Minister, another participant asks that in the event of a reunification, has the Irish government signaled a willingness to financially support the costs associated with reunification? I guess also the question really opens up the possibility there about the expense of reunification. How is that going to be worked out? Should a referendum be successful?
Well, I think there are a number of issues in relation to a referendum. One of them is, yes, of course, unionism needs to be made comfortable with the idea of constitutional change. Now that they've actually lost the majority, the support of unionism is not necessary in terms of constitutional change. But I do think that those of us who want to see bring that about in a peaceful fashion have a responsibility to try and engage as many people as we possibly can to give certainty and guarantees to people. We grew up in a state where my parents and my grandparents, that their rights weren't protected, they weren't respected. Their identity wasn't, their democratic rights weren't protected. Their rights to housing and jobs were not protected and discriminated against. And we have to ensure that that's not the sort of Ireland that I want to live in. So I want people who identify and consider themselves British and loyal to the Crown and whatever else culturally and religiously different from myself and how I grew up, that their rights and entitlements are protected and that we have the strongest possible human rights provisions. And part of the building of the infrastructure of the Good Friday Agreement was to protect rights and identities and to ensure that there was space for everyone. And I think those provisions should pertain in any discussion on a new constitutional arrangement on the island. So, of course, we do want to ensure that unionists and people who identify as unionists are as comfortable as they can possibly be. We want to address the issues that are of concern to them. But the referendum is quite clear that the majority required for this is 50% plus one. And if 50% plus one is enough to sustain and maintain the union, 50% plus one in the other direction is enough to end the union. And so people should recognise that and prepare for a different future. And they will find in us a willing partner in terms of trying to design a new constitutional system which respects and protects the identities of everyone who lives on the island.
It'll certainly be interesting to see. You already brought up a little bit about the founding of Northern Ireland. Of course, next year marks the 100th year. Yesterday, the Secretary for State, Brandon Lewis, launched the historical commemoration, making Northern our story in the making, Northern Ireland Beyond 100. Sinn Féin and SDLP both have opted out of officially contributing to that conversation. Yesterday, when the Secretary launched it, many of the questions about the commemoration were really about the legacies of the Troubles and how those are going to be dealt with going forward. Obviously, there's a lot of outstanding issues here around the historical investigation units and many other things that were in the Storm and House Agreement. In the time we have remaining, maybe you could just discuss how you see dealing with the past going forward, developing here. Here in Boston, I think there's a particular interest in the Finucane case and how that has been kind of working its way through the system. So people I think are eager to know, how is the legacy of the past going to be addressed? Or what's the next step?
Well, I think the discussion, as you framed it at the start, in relation to the centenary of the creation of the Northern State, which is the centenary of partition on the island, and some expectation that we should celebrate that. I mean, from our perspective, it was the greatest injustice done to the island. So how could you celebrate a drawing of a line on the map by the British state, which effectively divided the country in two, and then all of the legacy that flowed from that on both sides of the border. The development of a very conservative state in the south, a development of a very rigid unionist state in the north, which denied rights and protections to its own citizens. So, I mean, what's to be celebrated in that? I recognise that for some people that is something they wish to celebrate, and they should be absolutely permitted to do that. And I think it does give us a platform, I think, for reflection on the full impact of partition on the island and all of the legacy that flowed from that, including the legacy of conflict, which was very bitter, very painful. I lived through it. It was very painful for a lot of people, and we recognise that because it was one thing to try and establish peace and working arrangements, political working arrangements, which we could try and look after the interests of the people that we represent and try and chart a better way into a future. But there were a lot of people continue to be damaged by the experience of the conflict and continue to have questions about truth and about justice, continue to physically suffer and suffer from the loss of loved ones. And we had to find some way. You can't erase that pain at all for everyone, but you had to some way of dealing with the legacy of the past, which recognised that and which tried to assist as many of the people who were affected by that as we possibly could. And we did come to an agreement some 4 or 5 years ago, all of the parties, which was remarkable, and that was supported by both the British government and the Irish government. But that has become stuck since, and now the British government have embarked on an entirely new direction, which is more focused about protecting their own state forces that were involved here, rather than actually dealing with the interests of the people who were damaged here. So dealing with the legacy of the past has been hugely challenging, and it wasn't easy to reach an agreement. So the fact that that agreement has been departed from unilaterally by the British government, I think, is a big challenge to us. And we continue to do that because no matter what we try to build, constantly we get reminders of things that went on in the past. Anniversaries arise, and It just is a constant, I suppose, drain on an attempt to create positivity and energy into political change. And it also is a duty on all of us to try and support those who've been damaged as a consequence of the conflict that we've had, to try and give them some closure in terms of the loss of loved ones and justice issues and truth issues that they see, and to try and ensure that the damage that they have suffered is recognised in some way. And I think all the parties are determined to do that, but we have had, if you like, a central plank of that pulled out of that agreement by the British government and their approach to it. They changed the entire process that we have decided. They have left the burden of financing that on the executive, which we don't have the resource to do. And a clear understanding was that most of the conflict happened under the British government's watch, not under a local administration watch. They would have a responsibility for assisting us in trying to deal with all of that. So it's a very complex and a very challenging area of work, and it's one that does need to be addressed, because it is, if you like, a handbrake on our ability to develop into the future. And there are people who still suffer, and they need and deserve support from all of us.
Well, thank you, Minister. And as soon as I think there are developments and breakthroughs, we'd love to have you here in Boston to talk about that. Of course, we're going to have to wait until, unfortunately, the pandemic is over. And I myself look forward to traveling back to Dublin and then up to Belfast and beyond shortly. I want to thank you for your time today and your good nature. I think you gave our audience a very comprehensive look at your roles and responsibilities as a leader in Sinn Féin, as a leader in finance, and addressing some of these really complicated political issues. I want to remind our audience to join us in January for the discussion with Diane Dodds on the Northern Ireland at Boston College. Global leadership conversations, and then on January 19th, as part of the Ireland at Boston College leadership series, we'll have Helen McEntee, Justice Minister, on to talk. Thank you again, Minister. Also, finally, I'd like to thank Andrew Elliott for his help in this. One final word, Minister. You have a great team around you. I want to thank them as well for having the patience to work through the Zoom and all of the conversations that go back and forth to setting this up. But thank you very much for your time today. It's very greatly appreciated, and I hope you have a great holiday season.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, we'll talk to you soon. Take care.